After a night with his mistress, he returned home to find the door locked. His wife and newborn were gone. What she left behind revealed a secret so devastating it shattered his life. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter's Stories. May the Almighty bless every woman with unshakable strength, endless dignity, and a heart that radiates love to everyone around her. May she be honored, cherished, and always protected, for she is the backbone of every family, the light of every home, and the power that shapes this world. Let her wisdom guide us, her courage inspire us, and her love surround us forever. Every woman in our lives, whether a mother, sister, wife, or daughter, is a treasure beyond measure. Respect her, uplift her, and never forget the countless ways she makes life beautiful. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." David Norell's key wouldn't turn in the lock, not because it was broken, but because Sharon had changed everything while he was still tangled in another woman's sheets. He stood on his own porch at 3 in the morning, expensive cologne mixing with the perfume Yvonne had sprayed on his neck, and felt the first whisper of something he'd later recognize as terror. The brass key that had opened this door for 6 years suddenly belonged to a different life. His phone buzzed, Yvonne texting, "Come back, baby, it's cold without you." David deleted the message and tried the key again. Nothing. He peered through the front window into darkness, so complete it felt deliberate. The motion sensor lights that usually flooded the entryway stayed dead. He pulled out his phone, illuminating the welcome mat Sharon had chosen last spring, the one with yellow flowers she'd smiled at in the store. "Cheerful," she'd said, rubbing her barely showing belly. His hands shook as he tried calling her, straight to a recording. "This number is no longer in service." Panic clawed up his throat. He fumbled for his emergency key, the one hidden under the ceramic frog by the back gate. Gone. Even the frog was gone. He circled the house like a stranger, trying windows that wouldn't budge, peering into rooms that looked hollow, even in shadow. Every window he touched felt like a rejection, every locked door another consequence of choices he'd made without thinking they mattered. The garage door opener didn't respond. He pressed it 15 times, each click louder in the suburban silence. A neighbor's dog started barking. Living room curtains across the street twitched. Someone was watching this unfold, watching him be locked out of his own life. David found himself back at the front door, pressing his forehead against the wood that smelled like the lemon polish Sharon used every Sunday. He'd mocked her for it once. "Nobody cares if the door shines," he'd said, scrolling through his phone while she worked. She'd looked at him with those dark eyes that used to dance when he walked into a room. "I care," she'd answered quietly. When had they stopped dancing? When had he stopped noticing they'd stopped? He jimmied the mail slot open, calling through the narrow opening. "Sharon, baby, I know you're upset, but we can talk about this. Sharon, please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Just let me in so we can talk." Silence answered. The kind of silence that lives in abandoned places. The kind that meant she wasn't just refusing to answer, she wasn't there at all. His phone flashlight caught something white on the entryway table, visible through the slot and envelope. He could just make out his name in Sharon's precise handwriting. Below it, something small and gold caught the light. Her wedding ring. David's stomach dropped like he'd been shoved off a building. He wedged his fingers through the mail slot, straining until his knuckles scraped raw against the metal. The envelope stayed just out of reach, mocking him, but he could see enough of what lay beside it. Hospital discharge papers, Sharon's name across the top. The timestamp burned into his vision even at a distance. 11:47 last night. While he'd been listening to Yvonne complain about her boss, while he'd been unbuttoning his shirt in her apartment, while he'd been choosing another woman over his wife for the 100th time, Sharon had been giving birth. Alone. David staggered backward, his Italian leather shoes slipping on the cheerful welcome mat. The motion sensor on his phone activated his security app, showing him the camera footage he'd forgotten existed. His fingers moved without conscious thought, scrolling backward through the feed. There, 11:20, the garage door opening. Sharon's sister helping her into view, one arm wrapped around Sharon's waist. Sharon moved like she'd been split open and barely stitched back together. Her face was grey, hospital bracelet bright against her dark skin. In her arms, wrapped in a blue blanket, a tiny form that was his son. His son David watched his wife pause at the threshold of the home they'd chosen together, the one with the good school district she'd insisted on. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate, just walked out into the night like she was leaving behind a burning building. Her sister threw one venomous glance at the camera before slamming the trunk. The car pulled away. Taillights disappeared around the corner. The timestamp read 11:38. He'd texted Yvonne at 11:45. "Stop worrying, I told you I'd stay the night." David replayed the footage, watched his wife leave again, and again, each time hoping he'd see something different, some sign that this wasn't real. The blue blanket shifted in her arms during the third replay, a tiny fist emerging, perfect and alive. That was his child, the baby they'd planned for. The nursery Sharon had painted yellow herself because David said contractors were too expensive. The crib they'd assembled together while Sharon laughed at his terrible instruction-reading skills. He grabbed the doorknob, rattling it hard enough to hurt his wrist. Sharon, I know you can hear me. Please, let me explain." But she couldn't hear him. She was gone. The houses around him stayed dark. The street stretched empty in both directions. Even the barking dog had given up. David's chest constricted. He pulled up her family's numbers, knowing before he dialed that they wouldn't answer. Sharon's mother let it ring twice before declining. Her sister blocked him mid-call. Her brother's phone went straight to voicemail, the generic recording that meant the blocking was intentional. He tried Sharon's best friend. Blocked. Her cousin. Blocked. The woman from her book club who'd been at their wedding. Blocked. They'd coordinated this, all of them. They'd helped her disappear while he'd been wrapped around another woman, making promises he never intended to keep. His phone buzzed Yvonne again. "You okay? You've been gone a while." The message sat on his screen beneath the photo of Sharon he'd never bothered to change. Their honeymoon in Jamaica. Her head thrown back, laughing at something he'd said, sun turning her skin luminous. Before the pregnancy weight, before the fatigue that had dulled her eyes, before he'd started noticing other women again, before he'd destroyed everything that mattered, David's knees buckled. He sat on the porch steps, his expensive suit crumpling. The motion sensor light finally died, plunging him into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. The neighborhood slept on, comfortable and secure in homes where men didn't come back at 3 a.m., smelling like betrayal and cheap perfume. He tried the mail slot again, desperate to reach that envelope. The metal bit into his wrist as he stretched, his fingertips brushing paper. Almost. His phone flashlight caught something else. Dark drops on the hardwood floor. Sharon had spent weeks refinishing herself, insisting they couldn't afford to hire anyone. He'd been annoyed by the noise, the chemical smell, the way she'd worked late into the night while he watched television in the basement. The drops led from the entryway toward the garage blood. Sharon had been hemorrhaging. She'd walked out of a hospital against medical advice, left a trail through the home she'd built, and disappeared into a city of millions, where she'd made damn sure he couldn't follow. David Norrell sat on his porch as dawn broke over houses where other men woke up beside their wives, kissed their children, lived the life he'd just incinerated. His phone buzzed again. Yvonne, then his assistant, then his mother calling about Sunday dinner. He answered none of them. The cheerful welcome mat beneath his feet had a dark stain now. He stared at it until his eyes burned, until the sun climbed high enough to expose him sitting there in his wrinkled suit and his guilt and his absolute aloneness. The locked door stayed locked. The woman he'd betrayed was gone. And somewhere in this city, his son was taking his first breaths without knowing his father's name. A jogger passed by, gave him a strange look, kept running. Morning traffic began its steady hum. The world moved forward. David sat frozen, still clutching his useless key, still staring at that locked door, finally understanding what he'd lost. Not just a wife, not just a son, but the entire future he'd been too arrogant to value until it evaporated. He stayed there until a police car rolled past slowly. The officer inside watched him for a moment, decided he wasn't a threat, drove on. David wondered what he looked like to strangers: a drunk, a burglar, a man whose life had ended while he was busy destroying it. All of the above, probably. By noon, neighbors were whispering. By evening, someone had called the homeowners association. By the next morning, David finally stood, joints screaming from hours of sitting, and walked to his car. He drove away from the house with yellow flowers on the welcome mat, from the life he'd obliterated, from everything that had mattered. He never looked back behind him. The locked door stayed locked. Inside, Sharon's wedding ring caught the morning light one last time before shadows swallowed it whole. Chapter 2. Ghost in his own life. 3 weeks of searching taught David that a woman who'd been invisible in his life could become completely untraceable when she chose to be. He stood in the precinct lobby for the 4th morning in a row, holding a missing persons report the desk sergeant refused to file. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in sickly yellow coffee burned in styrofoam cups, abandoned on plastic chairs. A drunk slept in the corner, smelling of desperation and yesterday's mistakes. This was David's world now, police stations and dead ends, and the growing realization that Sharon had planned this perfectly. "Sir, for the last time, your wife isn't missing. She left. That's legal." The sergeant's name tag read, Williams. He had the tired eyes of a man who'd seen this story play out 1,000 times. "You got divorce papers. She made her intentions clear." "She took my son." David's voice cracked on the last word. He hadn't slept in days, hadn't showered. The same suit he'd worn that night hung off his frame like a costume from someone else's life. He'd lost weight, couldn't remember his last real meal. "Your son, according to these papers, is with his mother. Also legal." Williams slid the report back across the scarred counter. "You want advice? Get a lawyer. Pay your child support. Maybe work on why she ran." David's phone rang. Yvonne. He rejected the call for the 30th time that week. Williams noticed, "That her?" The sergeant's voice carried judgment David couldn't argue against. "No." The word tasted like ash, like everything he'd destroyed. Then who? David didn't answer. He gathered the useless papers, walked out into morning traffic, and stood on the sidewalk trying to remember where he'd parked. Cars honked. People flowed around him like he was a stone in a river. The city moved on. Life continued. Somewhere in this sprawl, Sharon was breathing the same air, living a life that had carved him out completely. His phone rang again, his mother this time. He answered, already knowing how this conversation would go. "David, where are you? You missed Sunday dinner. You missed work. Your secretary called me. What's happening?" "She's gone, Mom. Sharon's gone. She took the baby, and I know. Her mother called me." The words hit like a slap. David stopped walking, nearly got hit by a bicycle messenger who swore at him as he swerved. "She what?" "She called to tell me what you did about the mistress, about missing the birth." His mother's voice shook. David had heard her cry exactly 3 times in his life, at his father's funeral, at his sister's wedding, when their dog died when he was 12. He heard it now. "How could you, David? How could you do that to her?" "Mom, that girl loved you. She cooked for you every night. She gave up her job when you asked her to. She never complained when you worked late. She painted the nursery herself because you said contractors were too expensive. And you—" The sound of a palm hitting a table cracked through the phone. "You were with another woman while your wife gave birth?" "I made a mistake. I need to find her and—" "No." The word came out hard. Final. "You need to leave that child alone. Leave Sharon alone. You lost the right to them." "She's my wife." "She was your wife. Now she's a woman smart enough to escape. I raised you better than this. Your father would be ashamed." His mother's voice broke. "I'm ashamed." The line went dead. David stood on the sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear, listening to silence. A mother pushing a stroller navigated around him. The baby inside gurgled, reaching for sunshine, dark skin, bright eyes. The woman smiled at her child with a tenderness that made David's chest split open. His son would have those eyes. Sharon's eyes. Would smile like that. Would grow up never knowing his father's name. He stumbled to his car, parked illegally with 2 tickets tucked under the wiper. Inside, the air was stale. Fast food bags littered the passenger seat. He'd been living out of this vehicle, unable to face the locked house, unable to go back to Yvonne, who'd stopped calling after he'd told her to never contact him again. That conversation had been short, brutal in its honesty. "You said you were leaving her," Yvonne had said, standing in her doorway in silk pajamas that had excited him a week ago. Now they just looked cheap, pathetic. A costume they'd both worn while destroying someone's life. "I lied. But she's gone now. We can finally be together. We can..." "There is no we. There never was. I used you to feel important. You let me because it made you feel chosen. We're both garbage. Stay away from me." He'd walked out while she was still processing the words. Her tears hadn't moved him. Nothing moved him except the memory of Sharon's grey face in that security footage, the trail of blood she'd left behind, the baby in her arms that should have been his moment too. David's phone buzzed. His lawyer. Finally. Someone who might actually help. "David, I have news. None of it good. Did you find her?" "No, but her attorney found me. Divorce papers are real. She's filing for full custody. Restraining order is in place. You can't contact her directly, can't go within 500 feet of her or the child." "How can she get a restraining order? I haven't done anything." "You hired 3 private investigators who showed up at her sister's house, her mother's church, and her former workplace. That's harassment. Her lawyer is good, David, really good. Whatever assets you're thinking about hiding, don't. She documented everything, bank statements, text messages. She even has security footage from the house showing you leaving that morning while she was in labor." David gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "I just want to talk to her. To explain." "There's nothing to explain. You abandoned her in labor. That's what the hospital records say. Nurses' notes mention her asking for you repeatedly, crying for you. Staff tried your phone, went to voicemail because you were busy. The lawyer's disgust bled through professionally neutral tones. "Do you understand how bad this looks? The judge is going to crucify you. I made a mistake. You made a choice. Now I need you to make another one. Do you want to fight this, or do you want to negotiate custody?" The question hung in the stale car air. Outside, life continued. People went to work, bought coffee, kissed their partners goodbye, lived in the world David had fallen out of. "I want to see my son. Then cooperate. Pay what she asks. Don't fight the restraining order. Show the judge you're remorseful. Maybe in a year or 2. "A year? Be grateful it's not. Never sign the papers I'm sending. Wire the support payment. And David, get therapy. You're going to need it for the custody evaluation, if there ever is one." The call ended. David sat in his car outside a police station that wouldn't help him, in a city that didn't care, with papers that would legally erase him from his son's life. His phone screen showed 17 missed calls from Yvonne before he'd blocked her. 0 from Sharon. 0 from anyone who mattered. The manila envelope arrived by courier that afternoon. Inside, divorce papers outlined exactly what Sharon thought he was worth. Nothing. She wasn't asking for alimony, didn't want the house, just full legal custody and child support calculated to the dollar at the bottom, in Sharon's handwriting. "Don't look for us. We're safe. We're better. We're done." David signed the papers in his car, using the steering wheel as a desk. His signature was illegible. His hand shook so badly he had to do it twice. He stared at his name on the line, the legal acknowledgement that he'd destroyed everything, and felt nothing. Numbness was easier than the alternative. That night, he drove to the house, still locked, still dark. He sat in the driveway until dawn, headlights illuminating the cheerful yellow flowers on the welcome mat. When the sun rose, he finally understood. Sharon wasn't coming back. His son would grow up without knowing his face. And David had no one to blame except the man staring back from the rearview mirror, hollow-eyed, unshaven, destroyed by his own choices. He started the engine, took one last look at the house where his marriage had died, and drove away. Behind him, automatic sprinklers activated across the neighborhood, watering perfectly manicured lawns in homes where fathers were waking up to kiss their children. Good morning, David drove toward nothing, toward anywhere, toward a future that felt like punishment, disguised as freedom. He had no destination, no plan. Just the growing realization that he'd traded everything real for something that was never real at all. And now he had nothing, nothing but regret, and the locked door he'd never open again. Chapter 3, The Woman Who Rebuilt Herself. Sharon Blunt had learned that survival wasn't about waiting for life to get better. It was about building something so solid that the past couldn't touch it. She stood in her new office, 2 years and 1,000 miles from the night she'd walked out bleeding, and felt nothing when her assistant buzzed about the potential client waiting. Feeling nothing had become her superpower. The trembling woman who'd cried through contractions while nurses whispered sympathetically was dead. Sharon had killed her deliberately, buried her deep, and built someone fiercer from the bones. "Send her in," Sharon said, straightening files that didn't need straightening. Her desk was organized, everything in its place. Control was something she'd learned to value after losing it so completely. Her firm occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse downtown, exposed brick. Industrial lighting. Clean lines that suggested competence without warmth. She'd chosen everything carefully, from the steel desk to the grey upholstered chairs that didn't encourage clients to get comfortable. This wasn't a therapy office. This was war headquarters. Women came here to fight, not to heal. Healing came later, after victory. Women came to Sharon when their worlds were ending, when husbands hid assets, when lawyers played games, when the system chewed them up and spat them out broken. Sharon had learned to speak the language of devastation fluently because she'd been fluent in it herself. She knew every stage of grief, every form of denial, every bargain women tried to make with reality. The door opened. A woman entered, late 30s, expensive highlights, designer bag clutched like a shield. Her makeup was professionally applied, but couldn't hide the purple shadows underneath. Sharon recognized that look. She saw it in the mirror once, the look of someone whose world had just ended, and they were still pretending it hadn't. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice, Ms. Blunt. The woman's voice caught. "I'm in trouble." "Sit." Sharon gestured to the uncomfortable chair. "Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. Especially the parts you're ashamed of. The parts that mattered most. The parts that determined whether Sharon could help or whether this woman was beyond saving. The woman perched on the edge, knees pressed together. "I've been in a relationship for 18 months. He said he was divorced. He wasn't his wife, just hired a lawyer. I received a subpoena yesterday for alienation of affection. They're suing me for everything. My savings, my business. I work in hospitality management and..." Sharon's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Hospitality management, the same bloodless corporate phrase Yvonne had used when David introduced them at a company party. Sharon could still see her, blonde, confident, laughing at David's jokes while touching his arm. Sharon had smiled through it because good wives didn't make scenes. Good wives trusted. Good wives were fools. "This man," Sharon said carefully, keeping her voice neutral, "what does he do?" "He's in real estate development, commercial properties. He said his marriage was over long before I..." The woman's voice cracked. "I didn't mean to destroy a family. He showed me texts from his wife calling him names, said she'd left him emotionally years ago. I believed him because I wanted to." The admission hung in the air. Sharon had heard this speech before, different words, same poison, but that last phrase, "because I wanted to," that was the crack in the facade. The tiny acknowledgement of willful blindness that separated victims from accomplices. "What's your name?" "Yvonne." The office air conditioning kicked on, humming in the sudden silence. Sharon's pen hovered above paper. Every nerve in her body screamed to throw this woman out, to tell her that karma was a bitch and she'd finally met hers, to scream about what women like her had destroyed. But Sharon had learned control, had learned that emotion was weakness in this world. Instead, Sharon set down her pen and looked directly into Yvonne's eyes. Yvonne stared back, confused. Then recognition dawned slowly, color draining from her already pale face. Her designer bag slipped from her lap to the floor with an expensive thud. "Oh my God, you're Sharon? David's Sharon?" "I'm not anybody's Sharon. I'm Ms. Blunt, and you're in my office asking for help." Sharon's voice could have frozen water. "Now, do you want representation or do you want to leave?" Yvonne opened her mouth, closed it. Tears spilled over her carefully applied mascara. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know you were pregnant. David said—" "Stop." Sharon held up one hand. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You saw what you wanted to see, heard what you wanted to hear. When did you meet David?" "At a conference. He said he and his wife were separated." "Wrong, try again. When specifically?" Yvonne's face crumpled. "6 months before I gave birth, which means you knew me. We met at that company party I was showing, clearly pregnant. You looked right at me." Sharon remembered that moment. Remembered Yvonne's eyes sliding over her belly like it was irrelevant, like Sharon was irrelevant. You thought what you wanted to think. That the pregnant wife was just a complication, an obstacle, something that would disappear if you ignored it hard enough." Sharon's voice was surgical, precise, cutting exactly where it needed to cut. "Men like David lie. Women like you let them because the truth is inconvenient. You had suspicions, you ignored them. There's a difference between being deceived and choosing not to know." "That's not fair." "Fair?" Sharon laughed, sharp and cold. "You want to talk about fair? I was hemorrhaging in a hospital room, having just given birth alone, and David was in your bed. My son's first moments on earth happened while his father was choosing you, but sure, let's discuss fairness." Yvonne was crying fully now, mascara streaking black lines down her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for—" "You didn't mean for consequences. Nobody ever does." Sharon pulled a fresh intake form from her drawer. "Now, do you want my help or not? Because despite everything, I'm actually very good at what I do. And what happened between you and David has nothing to do with whether you deserve to lose everything you've earned to another man's lies." Yvonne wiped her face with shaking hands. "Why would you help me?" Sharon walked to the window overlooking the street where afternoon traffic crawled through heat shimmer. Somewhere in this city, her son was napping in the apartment she'd furnished with furniture from thrift stores. Her sister was watching him while Sharon worked 80-hour weeks building something that could never be taken away, building something that was entirely hers. "I help you because you're paying me, because you're a client who needs representation, because I don't believe women should lose everything for being stupid about men. God knows I was stupid about one." Sharon turned back. Yvonne was standing now, gathering her bag. "But understand this, if you lie to me once, I drop you. If you waste my time, I charge you double. If you ask me anything about David, we're done. And don't ever pretend you were innocent in this. You knew enough. You chose not to know more. There's a difference, and we both know it. Clear?" "Good. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Bank statements going back 2 years, lease agreements, tax returns, everything documenting that you had no knowledge of his marriage. Even though we both know you had suspicions you chose to ignore, bring proof of those suspicions too. Text messages where you asked questions, anything showing you tried to verify his story. I'll be there. Don't be late." Yvonne left quickly, heels clicking on hardwood until the door closed behind her. Sharon stood alone in her office, watching her reflection in the window darken as the sun moved. The woman staring back wore a tailored navy suit that cost half what she'd spent on her wedding dress. Her natural hair was cut short, professional. No softness, no vulnerability, just sharp angles and sharper eyes. Her phone buzzed. Her sister. "Caleb learned a new word today, says more when he wants snacks. He's perfect. You coming home for dinner? Sharon typed back, running late. Save me a plate. She sat back at her desk, pulled up Yvonne's case file, and began outlining strategy. The work consumed her. Numbers and law and cold hard facts that didn't care about feelings. This was her language now. This was her power. This was what she'd built from the wreckage of her marriage. 2 hours later, her assistant knocked. Ms. Blunt, your 6 o'clock is here, the Johnson custody case. Sharon saved her files. Another client. Another crisis. Another woman who needed someone to fight when she couldn't fight anymore. This was her life now. Building other women up from ruins. Maybe because no one had built her up. Maybe because she'd learned to build herself. Either way, Sharon Blunt was no longer the woman who'd cried for a man who never came. That woman was dead, and Sharon had never felt more alive. She gathered her files, checked her reflection one last time, armor firmly in place, and walked out to meet the next woman whose world was ending. Sharon would help her survive it, help her rebuild, help her understand that endings were just different kinds of beginnings if you had the courage to start over the way Sharon had. She'd burned down her old life and built something better from the ashes, and every woman who walked through her door would learn that they could do the same. Chapter 4. The Cost of Everything. David had spent 2 years becoming the man Sharon deserved, but transformation was warfare, fighting the entitled bastard he'd been every single day. He stood in the break room of Horizon Shelter, scrubbing dried oatmeal off high chairs while the morning chaos swirled around him. A toddler screamed for her mother. A baby wailed from the nursery. Someone's burned toast set off the smoke alarm again. The noise used to make his head pound. Now it was just the soundtrack of other people's survival, the background music to lives he'd never had to live until now. You missed a spot. David looked up. Ruth stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest like a barrier he'd never fully cross. She was 60-something, built like someone who'd survived things David couldn't imagine, with eyes that saw through every excuse. She'd thrown him out of this shelter 4 months ago for being exactly what he was, a rich man playing at redemption. Where? David asked, scanning the high chair with eyes that had learned to actually see dirt instead of just pretending to clean. There, she pointed with one thick finger, and on the table, and under your shoes. You tracking everything you step in, boy. Haven't figured that out yet. David looked down. Dried oatmeal clung to his sneaker treads like evidence of carelessness. He grabbed paper towels, got on his knees, started cleaning. The floor was cold, hard. His knees protested, but he ignored them. Ruth watched him scrub. Better. You're learning. High praise from a woman who'd told him on his first day that his money was useless here. His connections meant nothing, and if he thought volunteering would make him feel better about himself, he should leave before he disappointed everyone. He'd left that first day, angry and defensive, came back 3 weeks later, slightly humbled. Left again after that disastrous encounter with the young mother he'd tried to counsel, the one where he'd said, "At least you have your kids," like that was supposed to comfort someone working 3 jobs just to keep them fed. Came back a 3rd time, ready to shut up and listen. Ruth had put him on cleaning duty. 6 weeks of toilets, floors, high chairs, and trash. Not once had she asked him to do anything more complex than follow directions. Not once had she praised him beyond these small acknowledgements. He was starting to understand why. Understanding took time. Real understanding, not the surface kind he'd been operating with his whole life. Johnson family needs their room cleaned. Mother's in the hospital. Emergency surgery. You'll watch the kids during group tonight. David's stomach dropped. Ruth, I don't know anything about... You'll figure it out, just like their mother had to figure it out when their father walked out. She turned to leave, then paused. Her voice softened just slightly. And David, those kids have been through enough. Don't bring your guilt into that room. They don't need your sad eyes feeling sorry for them. They need someone to make dinner not taste like desperation. Can you do that? Yes. Prove it. Ruth left him kneeling on the floor, paper towels soaked with oatmeal, the weight of her expectation crushing his chest. He'd been coming here for months and she still didn't trust him, still saw him as the man who'd walked in thinking charity was writing a check, still tested him every single day to see if he'd quit. But he wouldn't quit, couldn't quit. This was all he had now. His therapist said Ruth was teaching him accountability. His therapist said a lot of things David was beginning to understand too late, like how narcissism wasn't always obvious, how entitlement could look like confidence, how he'd spent his entire adult life believing the world revolved around his needs and everyone else was just scenery in the movie of his life. Sharon had never been scenery. She'd been the whole world, and he'd treated her like wallpaper, background decoration in a life he thought was all about him. David finished cleaning, checked on the Johnson kids, two girls who barely looked at him, who'd learned early that men weren't reliable, and started preparing dinner in the industrial kitchen: spaghetti, garlic bread. Nothing fancy. Half the residents had dietary restrictions. The other half had kids who only ate 3 things. He chopped vegetables while Ruth supervised the evening group session down the hall. Through the walls he heard fragments of stories. A woman describing how her ex-husband drained their accounts the day she filed for divorce. Another talking about missing her son's birthday because she was working 3 jobs to afford the lawyer who might get her custody back. A third breaking down completely, apologizing for crying, then crying harder when the group told her she had nothing to apologize for. These women were strong, stronger than David had ever been, stronger than he'd probably ever be. David's knife slipped. Blood welled from his thumb, bright red against his pale skin. He wrapped it in paper towels, kept chopping. The pain felt appropriate, deserved. A tiny penance for sins that could never be fully paid. He wondered if Sharon had nightmares still, if she woke up sometimes in that hospital room, alone, bleeding, calling for him. He served dinner at 6. The Johnson girls picked at their plates with the suspicious wariness of children who'd been disappointed before. The littlest one, maybe 5, watched him with eyes that reminded him of every child he'd ever failed, starting with his own. "It's okay if you don't like it," David said quietly. "I can make you something else. I want my mama. I know. She'll be back soon. She's very strong. Stronger than you." The question landed like a fist to his chest. David met those suspicious eyes, Sharon's eyes, his son's eyes, every child's eyes who'd ever watched a parent fail. "Yes, much stronger than me. Your mama is one of the strongest people in the world." The girl seemed satisfied by this answer. She ate 3 bites, small victories, in a world built on survival. After dinner, David cleaned while Ruth finished paperwork in her cramped office that smelled like coffee and determination. He knocked on the door frame. She waved him in without looking up from whatever form she was filling out. "I need to tell you something," David said. "Then tell it. I messed up today. That woman yesterday who asked about job training programs, I told her she should just try harder, that if she wanted it badly enough, she'd find a way, Ruth. I didn't realize how that sounded until she left. How cruel it was. How ignorant." "I know, she told me. Said you made her feel like her poverty was a personal failing." Ruth finally looked up from her paperwork. "You know what I told her? That I'm an asshole. That you're learning. That you grew up with money and never had to fight for anything, so you don't understand yet that trying harder isn't enough when the system is rigged against you from birth." She leaned back in her chair. "But you're starting to see it. That's why you're still here, even though I keep making you do the worst jobs. Because somewhere in that thick skull of yours, you're beginning to understand that good intentions don't mean shit without action and humility." David's throat tightened. "I don't know if I can do this. Every time I think I'm getting it, I say something stupid. Good. You should feel uncomfortable. You should question every instinct because your instincts are garbage. They were built by privilege and entitlement and thinking the world owed you something just for existing." Ruth stood, walked around her desk until she was close enough that he could see the lines around her eyes, the scars on her hands from decades of hard work. "You want to know why I let you keep coming back?" "Why?" "Because you come back. Most men like you volunteer once, post about it on social media for the attention, and disappear when nobody throws them a parade. You've been here 4 months. You do every terrible job I give you without complaining. You show up on time. You listen when you're wrong. That's not redemption, but it's the foundation of it. I'll never be redeemed. Probably not, but you might become useful. That's better anyway. Redemption is for you. Being useful is for everyone else. Ruth dismissed him with a wave of her hand. David drove home to his small apartment, nothing like the house he'd shared with Sharon, and found an envelope taped to his door, his mother's handwriting, neat and precise. Inside, one sentence. Your son turned 2 last week. I wasn't invited to his party, neither were you. David sat on his threadbare couch in the apartment, with its second-hand furniture and its silence, holding the note until the paper wrinkled in his grip. Somewhere in this city, Caleb was walking, talking, learning the world, growing up without knowing David's name, growing up better for it, probably. Sharon had built a life for their son, a good life, a life David had no part in except the monthly support payment that left his account automatically. His phone buzzed. Ruth. Tomorrow, 6 a.m. We're expanding the childcare program. I need someone to paint the new room. Bring work clothes you don't mind ruining. David typed back, I'll be there. He set an alarm, lay down fully dressed because he was too tired to change, and stared at the ceiling until sleep came. In his dreams, he heard a child crying for someone who would never come. He woke up unsure if the crying was Caleb's or his own, or every child he'd failed by being the kind of man who chose himself over everyone else. The alarm blared at 5:30. David dragged himself to the shower, dressed in clothes already paint-stained from previous projects, and drove through empty streets to the shelter. Ruth was already there, coffee in hand, surveying the empty room that would become a safe space for children whose fathers had failed them, just like David had failed Caleb. You ready to work? Ruth asked. Yes. Good, because these kids deserve better than what they got. We're going to give them better, not perfect, just better. David picked up a paint roller and started covering walls that had seen too much pain. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. It was just work. Honest work. The only kind that mattered anymore. And maybe, in some small way, it was enough. Not enough to undo what he'd done, but enough to be something other than the man who'd destroyed everything good in his life. Chapter 5. Collision Course. Sharon had 20 seconds to decide if she'd run or stand her ground, and she'd promised herself she'd never run from anything again. The charity gala had been Jonathan's idea. You need to expand your network beyond crisis management, he'd said reasonably, using that calm voice that made everything sound sensible. Show people there's more to you than divorce wars. Sharon had resisted at first. She hated these events. The performative wealth, the shallow conversations, the way men looked at her when Jonathan stepped away to get drinks. But Jonathan had invested significantly in her firm, had introduced her to clients who'd transformed her business from surviving to thriving. She owed him the effort. More than that, she wanted to be someone who could attend a gala without feeling like an imposter. Now she stood in a ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers, wearing an emerald gown Jonathan had insisted suited her complexion, watching her past shatter champagne glasses across marble floors 20 feet away. The sound echoed through the suddenly quiet space. People turned to look David. He looked terrible. Weight loss had carved his face into angles she didn't recognize. His server's uniform hung loose on a frame that used to fill out expensive suits with confidence. His hair was graying at the temples, making him look older than his years. But his eyes, those were the same eyes that had looked at her across a college library and said, I'm going to marry you someday. Those same eyes were locked on her now with an expression she couldn't name: shock, longing, regret, all of the above. Sharon felt Jonathan's hand warm on her back. Light, respectful. Everything David had stopped being years before the end. Sharon, you all right? Jonathan's voice was soft, concerned, asking without demanding. She could have lied, should have lied. But Jonathan deserved honesty, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. That's David. Jonathan's hand stiffened slightly against her spine. The one who... Yes. Do you want to leave? The question was genuine. No judgment, no demands, just a simple offer to protect her from discomfort. Sharon felt a rush of affection for this man who'd somehow slipped past her defenses without her noticing, who'd become important without asking for importance. No, I want to stay. Then we stay. David was moving toward them now, not gracefully. He dropped an entire tray of champagne flutes, and people were staring and whispering behind manicured hands, but with the desperate determination of someone who'd spotted salvation across a crowded room. Sharon's pulse hammered in her throat. Her body wanted to flee. Her mind remembered hospital rooms and locked doors and the sound of her own voice begging nurses to call him just one more time. But her spine, reinforced by 2 years of fighting other people's battles and winning, held firm. She wouldn't run, wouldn't give him that satisfaction, wouldn't prove that he still had any power over her life. David reached them as other servers rushed to clean the shattered glass with quiet efficiency. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Sharon could smell cheap detergent on his uniform, far enough that he understood his place in her world, now nowhere. Sharon. Her name came out wrecked, like he'd been holding it in his mouth for years. Jonathan, I'm David. Norell. Jonathan extended his hand with the grace of a man comfortable in any situation, someone who'd spent decades navigating social complexities with ease. Jonathan Reeves, Sharon's business partner. David's face did something complicated when Jonathan said partner. Hope flickered and died in rapid succession. Fear took its place, then resignation. Sharon couldn't tell what he was thinking anymore. Didn't want to tell this man was a stranger wearing her ex-husband's face, playing a role in a life that no longer concerned her. Could I speak with you? David addressed Sharon directly now, ignoring Jonathan entirely. Just for a minute, please. I need to tell you... No. The word landed harder than she intended, echoing slightly in the suddenly attentive space around them. Conversations had stopped. People were watching this drama unfold with the barely disguised interest of those who loved other people's misery. David flinched like she'd struck him across the face. I just need to tell you, you're addressing the wrong person. Sharon's voice could have cut glass, could have drawn blood. The woman you betrayed no longer exists. I buried her. She's dead and gone, and you don't get to speak to her ghost. I know I have no right. You're correct, you don't. So stop trying to give yourself the right through persistence or public spectacle. Sharon turned to walk away, conversation definitively over. But David followed, stumbling over his own feet in his desperation. Jonathan moved slightly, positioning himself between them without being obvious about it, creating a barrier with his body. Sharon, please. I just need you to know, I don't care what you need. I stopped caring what you needed the moment you chose someone else over our son's birth, the moment you decided your pleasure mattered more than my life. The words echoed in the suddenly silent space around them. Nearby guests pretended not to listen while clearly listening, storing this gossip for later. Sharon felt eyes on her back. Judgment, curiosity, pity. She didn't care. Let them stare. Let them judge. She was done performing for other people's comfort. David's face crumpled like paper being wadded up. I know I can't. There's no excuse for what I... Then stop trying to make one. Stop trying to rewrite history. Stop trying to make yourself feel better about destroying everything good in your life. Sharon walked toward the terrace doors, needing air, needing space, needing distance from this man and his guilt and his transparent attempt at absolution that had nothing to do with her healing and everything to do with his comfort. But David followed her outside into the night that smelled like expensive flowers and desperation and champagne. The terrace was empty. String lights glittered overhead like false stars. In the distance, the city sprawled in all directions, oblivious to this small collision of past and present. Sharon turned on him, emerald gown catching the light, making her look powerful in a way she'd never looked during their marriage. What part of no are you struggling with? I'm not asking for forgiveness, I just... David's voice broke into pieces. I just needed you to know I'm trying to be better, to deserve. Deserve what? Me? You'll never deserve me. Our son. You weren't there when he was born. You chose Yvonne's bed over the delivery room. You chose yourself over everyone else, always consistently, without fail. That doesn't change just because you feel bad about it now. Guilt isn't the same as change. I don't expect you to believe me. Good, because I don't. I don't believe in your guilt or your remorse or whatever story you're telling yourself these days to sleep at night. I believe in action, in consistency, in people proving they've changed over years, not months. And even then, David, even if you became a saint tomorrow and spent the rest of your life helping others, it wouldn't matter to me because I'm done. I'm finished. I'm free of you in every way that counts. She watched him absorb this truth, watched his face do what faces do when hope dies messily, publicly, without dignity. Part of her, the part that remembered being 23 and in love with possibility, wanted to soften it. Tell him she appreciated the effort, encourage his growth, be kind. But that part of her was buried with the woman who'd believed love conquered all, who'd believed commitment meant anything to a man who'd never learned to put anyone else first. If you contact me again, my lawyers will destroy you. Sharon straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. But if you're actually serious about change, prove it where it matters, not to me. I'll never believe you anyway. Prove it to yourself, to other people, to the world. Just leave me the hell alone while you do it. She walked back inside, leaving David standing alone under string lights that made everything look softer than it was. Jonathan waited just inside the doors, concern etched across features that somehow made kindness look distinguished rather than weak. You okay? Getting there. Maybe. Want to leave now? Sharon looked back through the glass. David hadn't moved. Just stood there like someone who'd lost the ability to navigate basic existence, something in her chest twisted, old muscle memory from loving him once. But she crushed it ruthlessly. That was then. This was now. And now she was someone different entirely. No, I want another drink, and I want to dance. Can you dance, Jonathan? Terribly. Perfect. I'm tired of men who do everything perfectly and nothing honestly. They moved back into the gala. Sharon pasted on her professional smile, made small talk with potential clients who had no idea what they'd just witnessed, laughed at Jonathan's dry humor, and didn't look back once at the man she'd left behind on that terrace hours later. Driving home in Jonathan's car with soft jazz playing, he said quietly, "You handled that well. I handled it the only way I could. Still, I'm proud of you. That took strength." The words shouldn't have mattered. Sharon had built a life where she didn't need validation from anyone, where her worth came from within rather than from external approval. But they mattered anyway, warming something cold inside her chest that had been frozen since the night she'd walked out bleeding. At her apartment, Sharon checked on Caleb, sleeping peacefully, her sister dozing in the chair beside his bed like a guardian angel. She paid her sister, saw her out with quiet thanks, then stood over her son's bed watching his chest rise and fall in the rhythm that meant safety, that meant he was alive and whole and hers. "You're safe," she whispered into the darkness. "I'll always keep you safe from men who can't keep promises." Caleb shifted, murmured something that might have been her name, or might have been nothing. Sharon kissed his forehead, inhaling the scent of his shampoo and innocence, then retreated to her own room. She sat by the window overlooking the city lights that never went out, that burned through the darkness like proof that life continued. David was out there somewhere in that sprawl of light and shadow, suffering probably, regretting certainly, becoming better possibly. She hoped he was not for his sake, not because she cared about his redemption or his peace of mind, but for the sake of every woman who might cross his path in the future, for the sake of every woman who might have ended up bleeding in a hospital room while he chose someone else, but hoping he changed and letting him back into her life were entirely different things, separate universes that would never intersect. Sharon had learned that distinction the hard way, through blood and tears and locked doors. She pulled out her laptop, worked until dawn on cases that actually mattered, and never once thought about emerald gowns or shattered champagne glasses, or the hollow look in her ex-husband's eyes that suggested maybe, just maybe, he understood what he'd lost. But understanding came too late. Always too late. That was the tragedy of men like David. They only learned the value of things after destroying them completely. Chapter 6. The Long Game. David learned that atonement wasn't a destination, but an endless road, and he'd walk it alone because that was exactly what he deserved. 18 months crawled past like decades. David's life had contracted to a routine so spare it barely qualified as living. Wake at 5, volunteer at the shelter until noon. Therapy at 2, where he dissected his failures with clinical precision. His part-time job processing insurance claims from 4 to 8. Home to his apartment where he ate reheated meals that tasted like cardboard and wrote letters to Sharon he'd never send. The letters lived in a shoebox under his bed. 247 of them. Some were apologies that spiraled into self-pity before he rewrote them into something honest. Some were updates about his life that seemed pathetic when he read them back. Most were just observations about the world Caleb was growing up in. Things David wanted his son to know if he ever got the chance to tell him, which he probably wouldn't. Dear Caleb, today I met a kid at the shelter who's exactly your age. He reminded me that I'm missing everything important. Your first words, your first steps, the way you laugh at things, the questions you ask. I deserve to miss it. But knowing I deserve it doesn't make it hurt less. Maybe it should. Maybe that's part of the punishment. He never mailed them. Sharon had been clear in her lawyer's letters. No contact meant no contact. The restraining order was explicit. 500 feet minimum distance. He'd measured it once on a map, tried to visualize what 500 feet looked like. It was nothing. The length of a city block. But it might as well have been the distance between planets. David's non-profit had grown beyond what he'd imagined possible when he started it as a guilt project. What began as throwing money at the problem, fund housing for single mothers, write checks, feel better, had evolved into something actually useful. Ruth had connected him with policymakers who actually cared. They'd pushed through legislation expanding childcare subsidies, created partnerships with employers who hired women transitioning from crisis situations, built a network of services that actually helped instead of just existing to make rich people feel better about inequality. David's name appeared in articles, occasionally local news covering the legislation. Trade publications discussing innovative community programs. He never gave interviews, never sought attention or publicity, just showed up, did the work, went home to his empty apartment where the silence was so complete it had weight. His mother called monthly now. Their relationship had thawed from frozen to merely cold. She didn't forgive him. She was clear about that. But she'd stopped hanging up immediately when he answered. "Your father would have liked what you're doing," she said during their last call, her voice carrying complicated emotions. "Even if he'd have hated why you're doing it." "I'm not doing it for redemption, Mom." "Then why?" David didn't have an answer. Or he did, but it was too complicated to explain over a phone call. Because Ruth needed help and the system was broken. Because he'd learned that the world was full of Sharons. Women betrayed by men who thought their desires mattered more than anyone else's survival. Because if he stopped moving, stopped working, stopped trying to be useful, he'd have to sit with what he'd done. And that was unbearable. That was the abyss he couldn't look into without falling apart completely. His phone buzzed. His lawyer with the monthly update. The annual child support adjustment is done. Sharon's lawyer sent the updated figures. You're current on everything. David paid whatever Sharon asked, never questioned it, never fought it. The money left his account automatically on the 1st of every month. He lived on what remained, which wasn't much after he donated most of his salary to the non-profit. His apartment reflected this. Second-hand furniture, no television, walls bare except for the bulletin board with Sharon's newspaper photo pinned to it. He'd sold the house finally after letting it sit empty for a year. Walked through it one last time with a realtor who didn't know its history, who just saw square footage and potential. The cheerful welcome mat was gone. So was every trace of Sharon's presence. The paint colors she'd chosen, the curtains she'd hung, the yellow nursery she'd painted herself while 7 months pregnant, because David said contractors were too expensive. New owners would paint over the memories, fill the rooms with their own lives, and never know that someone's marriage had died in the master bedroom, while another woman's perfume still clung to the sheets. David had stood in the empty nursery for 20 minutes, staring at walls that had been yellow and were now just blank white primer, feeling nothing. Numbness was a mercy when the alternative was drowning. One Saturday afternoon, his mother surprised him by showing up at his apartment, unannounced. She took one look at his second-hand furniture, his nearly visible ribs through his cheap shirt, and sighed deeply. "You're punishing yourself. I'm living within my means, living honestly for the first time in my life. You're living like a monk who took vows. David, this isn't healthy. Neither was cheating on my wife. Neither was abandoning my son. I'm just balancing the scales the only way I know how." His mother sat on his worn couch, looked around at the apartment that screamed loneliness and penance, and said something he hadn't expected. "I saw her. Sharon. Last week." David's world stopped spinning. His heart forgot how to beat. "Where?" "At a restaurant downtown. Nice place. She was with that man from the gala, Jonathan and Caleb." His mother's voice softened into something that sounded like grief. "He's beautiful, David. Looks just like her. Smart too. I heard him talking full sentences. Polite. Happy. Really happy." The knife in David's chest that had been there for years twisted deeper, finding new places to cut. "Did she see you?" "Yes," she nodded. "That was all. Just acknowledgement that I existed. Civil but cold." His mother's eyes were wet. "But Caleb didn't know me. My grandson doesn't know his grandmother exists. He saw me looking at him and smiled like I was just another stranger." They sat in silence that felt heavier than any words. Outside, a siren wailed past. Life continuing in all its chaos and pain. The world spinning regardless of individual suffering. People falling in love, making mistakes, destroying families. The same patterns repeating endlessly like some cosmic joke. "I brought you something." His mother handed him an envelope with careful hands, like it might explode. "Sharon's firm is in the news. Some big case she won. I thought you'd want to know she's doing well, that she's thriving without you." David took the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. Just held it, feeling the weight of whatever truth it contained. "Thank you. Are you eating enough? You look skeletal." "Yes." "Are you sleeping?" "Sometimes, when the dreams let me." "Are you ever going to forgive yourself?" The question hung between them like smoke, impossible to grasp. David had no answer. His therapist asked the same thing weekly. Ruth asked it in her own blunt way. Everyone seemed to think forgiveness was the goal, the finish line, the point where healing began. But David had learned something over 18 months of hard work and harder reflection. Self-forgiveness was another form of selfishness. It was about making himself feel better, making his life easier. What mattered was becoming someone different, someone who wouldn't make the same choices if given the chance, someone actually useful to the world, instead of just taking up space and using people. Whether he ever felt okay about himself again was irrelevant, beside the point. A luxury he didn't deserve. After his mother left, David opened the envelope with shaking hands. Sharon's face looked out from a newspaper photo, standing on courthouse steps with her clients. 30 women who'd won a massive settlement against their former employer. Sharon's expression was fierce, triumphant, alive in a way David had never seen during their marriage. She looked like someone who'd discovered her true self after years of being someone else's idea of who she should be. He'd thought she was happy during their marriage. Now he understood she'd been small, contained. He'd kept her small without even realizing it, like a gardener who doesn't understand he's been pruning the tree to death every time he'd dismissed her thoughts, talked over her in conversations, made decisions without asking her opinion. He'd been training her to shrink, to fit into the shape he wanted rather than the shape she needed to be. The woman in this photo didn't shrink for anyone. David pinned the article to his bulletin board, right next to the others he'd collected over the months. Not because he wanted her back. He was clear-eyed enough to know that ship had sailed and sunk. Not because he thought he deserved another chance at being in her life, just because seeing her succeed made the work feel worth it, made his suffering feel like it had some purpose beyond mere punishment. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. Against every instinct that said, "Ignore unknown calls," he answered. "Mr. Norrell, this is Attorney Fitzgerald. I represent Sharon Blunt. I have instructions to call regarding a matter concerning your son." David's heart stopped. Literally stopped for one terrible second before remembering to beat again. "Is he okay? Is Sharon—" "Everyone's fine. Ms. Blunt has reviewed your financial disclosures and your work with Horizon Shelter. She's prepared to discuss supervised visitation under strict conditions. Are you interested?" The words didn't make sense. David stood in his empty apartment, phone pressed to his ear so hard it hurt. Unable to form coherent thoughts, Sharon was letting him see Caleb. After everything, after the betrayal and the abandonment, and the 2 years of deserved silence. Why? What had changed? Was this real, or was he dreaming? "Mr. Norrell, are you there?" Yes, I'm interested. Whatever she wants, whatever conditions she sets. Yes, God, yes. I'm emailing you the terms, review them carefully. If you agree, we'll schedule an initial meeting. Understand that Ms. Blunt reserves the right to terminate visitation at any time if you violate any term. This is not about your rights. This is about your son's well-being. Do you understand the distinction? I understand. I understand completely. Good, expect the email within the hour. The line went dead. David stood motionless in his tiny apartment, trying to process what had just happened. Sharon was letting him see Caleb. After everything he'd done, after destroying their family, after choosing himself over them consistently and without thought. Why? The email arrived exactly 60 minutes later. 4 single-spaced pages outlining terms so restrictive they might as well have been a prison sentence. David read each condition carefully, knowing each one was earned. Complete financial transparency. Trust fund for Caleb that David couldn't touch under any circumstances. Continued volunteer work, verified monthly. Therapy records disclosed to Sharon's lawyer quarterly. Meetings only when Jonathan Reeves was present. No attempts to undermine Sharon's parenting decisions. No discussion of the past unless Caleb asked directly. No gifts without pre-approval, no promises about the future, no attempts to contact Sharon directly. And at the end, in bold, these terms are non-negotiable. Acceptance must be confirmed within 48 hours. Failure to comply with any condition will result in immediate termination of all contact. David pulled up the response form with trembling fingers, typed 3 letters. Yes. Sent it before he could second-guess himself, before he could wonder if he deserved this mercy, before gratitude and terror could paralyze him completely. His phone rang immediately. Ruth. I heard from Sharon's lawyer. You really doing this? How did you? I'm one of your references, idiot. They called me an hour ago asking if you're genuine or just performing contrition. I told them the truth. That you're still a work in progress, but you show up, that you do the work even when nobody's watching. That's all anyone can ask. Ruth, don't thank me. Just don't screw this up. That little boy doesn't need another disappointment from his father. He's had enough of those to last a lifetime. She hung up before David could respond. He sat on his threadbare couch, Sharon's photo still on his bulletin board, and let himself cry for the first time since the night he'd found the locked door. Not tears of relief or joy, just release. The kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for so long you'd forgotten what oxygen felt like. He cried for the man he'd been, for the woman he'd destroyed. for the son who'd grown up without him, for all the moments he'd never get back, and maybe, just maybe, for the possibility that he could be someone different going forward, even if Sharon never forgave him, even if Caleb never called him Dad, even if this was the closest he ever got to redemption. It was more than he'd earned, and he'd spend the rest of his life trying to deserve it. Chapter 7. What She Built. Sharon Blunt stood in the penthouse office she'd earned with her own brilliance and realized that revenge had never been about making David suffer. It was about making him irrelevant. The view from her window showed the city in miniature, stretching to horizons she couldn't see, ant-sized people pursuing ant-sized dreams down there. Somewhere in that sprawl, David was probably volunteering at that shelter, trying to rebuild his shattered self-image brick by painful brick. Sharon felt nothing about it. Not satisfaction, not bitterness, not the burning rage that had sustained her through those first months. Just the distant acknowledgement that he existed in a world that no longer revolved around her pain. Her phone buzzed with a text. Jonathan. Dinner tonight? Caleb wants Italian, says he needs pasta to grow big and strong. Sharon smiled. Genuine easy. The kind of smile she'd forgotten she could make until Jonathan had coaxed it out of her with patience and terrible jokes and steady, undemanding presence that never asked for more than she could give. I'll bring wine. See you at 7. Their relationship had evolved so gradually, Sharon couldn't pinpoint when partnership became something more. Maybe the night Jonathan found her crying over a case, a woman whose ex-husband had kidnapped their daughter, and he'd just sat with her in silence until she was ready to talk. No platitudes, no advice, just presence. Maybe the morning Caleb had called him Johnny, and Jonathan's eyes had gone suspiciously bright. Maybe the dozens of small moments in between where he'd shown up without expectation of anything in return, where he'd proven that not all men were David. He'd asked her to dinner the previous month, actual dinner, a date that both of them recognized as different from their usual friendly meals. Sharon had panicked. I don't know if I can. Then don't. We continue as we are. I won't disappear just because you're not ready. I'm here regardless, Sharon. That's the point. You don't have to earn my presence. They'd gone to dinner anyway, because Sharon was tired of being afraid. Talked about everything except romance or past relationships, discovered they both hated pretentious art galleries and loved stupid action movies with implausible physics. Argued about policy with the comfort of people who knew disagreement didn't mean abandonment. Laughed about Caleb's latest obsession with dinosaurs and whether velociraptors could actually open doors. At the end of the night, Jonathan had walked her to her door and said, "This was nice. Let's do it again sometime. No pressure, no expectations." He'd kept that promise. No pressure, no expectations, just presence. The rarest gift of all, her assistant knocked on the glass door. "Miss Blunt, the celebration is starting. Everyone's waiting for you." Right. The office party for winning the discrimination case that had consumed the last 6 months of her life. 30 women finally compensated for years of systematic abuse. It should feel triumphant. It did, mostly, but underneath the satisfaction was exhaustion that went bone deep. Fighting other people's battles took a toll that compounded over time. Sharon joined the party. Champagne she didn't drink because she'd learned alcohol didn't solve problems. Catered food she barely touched because her stomach was still tight from the trial. Clients who hugged her too tightly and cried on her shoulder about how she'd changed their lives. She absorbed their gratitude, returned their affection as best she could, and felt the familiar weight of carrying other people's pain. It was an honor. It was also exhausting. Later, on Jonathan's terrace, with the party noise muffled behind them and stars barely visible through light pollution, he said something unexpected. "I need to tell you something, and it's going to sound terrible." Sharon tensed immediately. Here it comes. The moment he reveals he's just like David. That patience was just strategy, that kindness was manipulation, that "I'm terrified of losing you the way I lost my wife." Not what she'd expected. Sharon turned to him, emerald gown from the gala still hanging in her closet, now wearing comfortable clothes that didn't cut into her waist. Jonathan, not to death, to my own stupidity, to my inability to be present. His voice was rough, honest, the kind of vulnerable that men usually hid behind confidence and deflection. I was so focused on building my business that I missed years with her, decades really. When she got sick, I realized I'd been absent. Even when I was physically there, I was in the room, but mentally I was always somewhere else, calculating, planning, winning deals that don't matter now. She died knowing I'd chosen work over her for our entire marriage. I won't do that again. You're nothing like him, Sharon said quietly, meaning David but not saying his name because he didn't deserve to be part of this conversation. I'm not comparing myself to David. I'm saying I understand the fear of trusting someone with your life again. I'm scared too. My late wife deserved better than I gave her. You deserve better than my workaholic tendencies and my emotional constipation and my complete inability to remember birthdays, even when they're written on my calendar. Sharon surprised herself by laughing. You forgot Caleb's birthday last month, completely forgot until I reminded you. I know, I felt terrible, still do. He didn't notice. He was too excited about the dinosaur book you got him the week before. He's been reading it every night, making me do different voices for each dinosaur. Jonathan's expression softened into something that made Sharon's chest ache in the good way. That kid is the best person I know, better than both of us combined. He really is. Sometimes I wonder how I made something so perfect when everything else I touched turned to ash. You made him perfect because you refused to let what happened to you define what happened to him. They stood in comfortable silence that felt more intimate than words. Inside, the party continued without them. People celebrating victory without understanding the cost. Sharon's phone buzzed repeatedly, clients sending thanks, her sister asking about dinner plans, her lawyer forwarding David's acceptance of the visitation terms. That last one made her chest tighten with complicated emotions she couldn't name. She'd debated for weeks before agreeing to let David see Caleb. Her initial instinct was pure protection. Keep her son away from potential disappointment, from repeating the pattern of abandonment, from learning that fathers couldn't be trusted. But Caleb was asking questions more frequently, smart questions that deserved honest answers. Why don't I have a daddy like the other kids? And did my daddy not want me? And is there something wrong with me that made him leave? Those questions hurt worse than David's betrayal. They hurt because they revealed how his choices affected not just her, but their innocent child who'd done nothing to deserve absence. Jonathan noticed her expression shifting. The David thing? Yeah, he agreed to everything. Didn't even try to negotiate or assert his rights. Just accepted every condition I set. How do you feel about that? I don't know, relieved, suspicious, both at the same time. Sharon leaned against the terrace railing, city lights spread below like fallen stars. Caleb deserves to know his father, but I'm terrified David will let him down again, that he'll show up for a few months and then disappear when it gets hard or inconvenient. So you set terms that make it nearly impossible for him to let Caleb down without you knowing immediately and being able to intervene. Is that wrong? Am I being controlling? It's smart, it's protective. It's what any good mother would do when the father has already proven himself unreliable. Jonathan moved beside her, not touching but present in that way he had of being supportive without being suffocating. For what it's worth, I'll be at every single meeting. David won't hurt that boy while I'm breathing. That's not a threat. That's just a fact. Sharon felt something crack in her chest. The good kind of crack, the kind that lets light into dark places. Jonathan Reeves, are you offering to be my son's protective barrier against his biological father's potential future failures? I'm offering to be whatever you and Caleb need. If that's a barrier, fine. If it's just another person who loves that kid unconditionally and wants to see him thrive, even better. I'm not trying to replace David. I'm just trying to be present in a way David never was. The words hung in the air between them. Love. He'd said it casually, applied to Caleb, but Sharon heard what he wasn't saying directly. what he was too careful to say outright without knowing she felt the same way. Without having permission to name the thing growing between them, "I need to tell you something too," Sharon said, heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Okay. I'm falling for you. Not falling, present progressive tense because it's still happening and I don't know where it ends." She took a breath. "It's terrifying and inconvenient, and I keep waiting for it to be a mistake, for you to reveal you're just like every other man who says pretty things until they get what they want. But you keep showing up and being decent and making me laugh, and I don't know how to protect myself from that. Don't know if I should even try." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, city sounds filling the space. Then, "Don't protect yourself. Or do. Either way, I'm staying. That's what I'm trying to tell you, Sharon. I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to, and even then I'd probably argue about it and try to change your mind." She kissed him before she could overthink it. Quick, impulsive, entirely unlike her usual careful approach to everything in her life. He kissed her back, gentle, asking permission with every moment, respecting boundaries she didn't even know she'd set. When they pulled apart, Sharon was crying. Happy tears for the first time in years. Confused tears because this wasn't supposed to happen to her again. Healing tears that tasted like salt and possibility. "I'm a mess," she whispered. "You're magnificent. I have trust issues that probably require professional intervention. I'll earn it, however long it takes. I'm probably going to self-sabotage because that's what I do when things get good. I'll wait it out, I'm patient. Spent 20 years building my business. I can spend 20 more proving I'm worth trusting. You're too good at this. It's suspicious. I had a lot of practice being bad at it with my late wife, learned from mistakes that cost me someone I loved, not making those mistakes again if I can help it." They stood wrapped around each other while the party died down inside and the city hummed below, and somewhere across town, David was probably writing letters he'd never send to a son he'd barely met. Sharon felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, which felt too simple for what this was. Something steadier, something sustainable, something that felt like it might actually last if she didn't sabotage it first. Hope. That's what it was. Hope that the future could be different from the past. Later that night, Jonathan asked officially, "Would you marry me? Not now, not even soon, but someday, when you're ready, if you're ever ready. No pressure, just putting the possibility out there." Sharon looked at this man who'd seen her at her absolute worst and stayed anyway, who loved her son like his own without trying to replace anyone, who forgot birthdays but remembered how she took her coffee and what cases stressed her out most, who was flawed and honest about it instead of pretending perfection. "Ask me again in a year, if you still want to." "I will. That's a promise." "I might say yes by then. I'll take those odds better than most investments I've made." Sharon went home that night to her son and her sister and her life that she'd built from literal rubble. She checked on Caleb, sleeping peacefully, dinosaur book still clutched in his small hands, and felt grateful for every brutal moment that had brought her here. David's betrayal had destroyed her old life, burned it to ash and scattered the remains. But she'd built something better from those ashes, something entirely hers. And that was the truest revenge of all, not making him suffer, making him irrelevant. Chapter 8. The Conditions. Sharon Blunt had learned that forgiveness wasn't weakness if you controlled every single term. The document sat on her kitchen table, coffee rings staining the corners where she'd read it obsessively for 2 months. David's acceptance letter. Simple, clean, no excuses or explanations or attempts to rewrite history. Just, "Yes, and thank you for giving me this chance." She'd expected him to fight something, to negotiate at least one condition, to assert his parental rights the way men usually did when their egos got involved in custody arrangements. Instead, he'd agreed to everything immediately, without a single call from his lawyer suggesting modifications, complete financial transparency, Jonathan's presence at all meetings, no unsupervised contact ever, No gifts without approval, no promises about future arrangements. Either he'd genuinely changed, or he was playing a very long game. Sharon was betting cautiously on option 1, but preparing extensively for option 2. "Mama, what's that paper?" Caleb climbed into the chair beside her, still in his dinosaur pajamas that were getting too small. He was growing so fast, talking in complete paragraphs, asking impossible questions that deserved honest answers. "Just work stuff, baby." "Is it about my daddy?" The question was casual, like he was asking about the weather. Sharon's coffee mug stopped halfway to her mouth. "What makes you think that?" "You always look sad when you read it. That special kind of sad where you're not crying but you're thinking about crying." He tilted his head, studying her with Sharon's own eyes. "And you said my daddy might visit someday. Is someday now?" How did you explain betrayal to someone who still believed people were fundamentally good? How did you prepare a child for meeting the man who'd chosen absence over presence? How did you protect him from disappointment while still giving him access to the truth? Maybe. Would you want that? Caleb thought about it with the serious consideration he gave to all important questions. Exactly like scars. "Okay, can I have pancakes?" Just like that, the moment passed. For Caleb, the conversation was over, filed away with other important information he'd process later. For Sharon, it was just beginning, spreading like ripples in water. She called Jonathan after breakfast, while Caleb was absorbed in his dinosaur book. "I think we should schedule the first meeting." "You sure?" "No, but Caleb's asking questions I can't answer honestly without introducing him to David. He deserves to make up his own mind based on reality, not my version of events." "When?" "This weekend. Neutral location. 1 hour maximum ground rules established beforehand. I'll be there, right beside you both." Sharon hung up and called her lawyer with hands that trembled slightly. "Schedule it. Saturday afternoon. The park on Riverside. 1 hour. Make sure David understands. One wrong move, one broken promise, one moment of putting himself first, and it's over. He doesn't get second chances with my son." Her lawyer hesitated. "Sharon, are you really ready for this? Because once you open this door, does it matter if I'm ready?" Caleb's ready to know his father exists as more than an abstract concept. That's what counts. My feelings are secondary to his needs. The week crawled past at the pace of continental drift. Sharon threw herself into work with the intensity of someone trying to outrun their thoughts. New cases, existing clients, court appearances that required her full attention, anything to avoid thinking about Saturday. But Thursday night, she found herself standing in front of her closet at midnight trying to decide what to wear to introduce her son to his father. What was the dress code for such occasions? Business casual to maintain authority? Aggressively casual to show she didn't care what David thought? Armor disguised as athleisure? Her sister found her holding 3 different shirts, close to tears she refused to shed. "Hey, what's wrong?" "I don't know what to wear. Isn't that stupid? I'm planning what to wear to let my ex-husband meet the son he abandoned, and I'm crying over shirt choices like this is a first date instead of a potential disaster." Her sister hugged her tightly, smelling like the lavender lotion she'd worn since high school. "It's not stupid. This is terrifying. You're allowed to fall apart." "I can't fall apart. Caleb needs me strong, needs to see that I'm okay so he knows it's safe to meet David. Caleb needs you human. There's a big difference. Kids learn more from watching us handle difficulty than from watching us pretend difficulty doesn't exist." Sharon wore jeans and a simple blue shirt. Nothing special. Nothing that suggested she'd tried or cared or put thought into this beyond basic appropriateness. She dressed Caleb in his favorite shirt, the one with a T-Rex on the front, that he'd insisted on wearing 3 days in a row before she'd successfully negotiated it into the laundry, and tried not to throw up from nerves. Jonathan picked them up in his car that always smelled like leather and coffee. He looked calm, steady. Exactly what Sharon needed when her own composure felt fragile. "You okay?" he asked quietly, while Caleb chattered in the back seat about dinosaurs and whether Stegosaurus could run fast. "Ask me in 3 hours." I'll be right beside you the whole time, both of you. That's a promise." They arrived early because Sharon couldn't stand the thought of David being there first, watching them approach. The park was busy with Saturday crowds, families picnicking, kids on playgrounds, dogs chasing frisbees. Normal life happening all around them while Sharon's world tilted sideways. David was already there anyway, early despite her plans, standing beside a bench wearing clothes that looked cheap and worn, nothing like the expensive wardrobe he'd maintained during their marriage. He'd lost more weight. Grey hair was more prominent at his temples. He looked older than his years, tired. Nothing like the confident man she'd married who'd thought the world existed to serve his needs. When he saw them, his face transformed, hope and terror mixing into an expression Sharon had never seen on him before, raw and unguarded. He started toward them, stopped himself, looked at Sharon for permission like a dog waiting for a command. She nodded once, just once. David approached slowly, like he was approaching something wild that might bolt if startled. His eyes locked on Caleb, drinking in details with desperate intensity. The shape of his face, the color of his eyes, the way he stood half-hidden behind Sharon's leg. Caleb peeked out with curious caution, studying this stranger who was somehow important. "Hi." David's voice cracked like something breaking. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Hi, Caleb. I'm David." Caleb studied him with serious eyes that missed nothing. "You're my daddy." "Yes, if that's okay with you. If you want me to be. Why weren't you there when I was born?" The question landed like a bomb in the carefully maintained peace. Sharon had told Caleb he could ask anything, that honesty was important. She hadn't expected him to open with the nuclear option, the question that mattered most. David's face went grey. He glanced at Sharon, not for rescue, just acknowledgement that this was hard, that he understood what he'd earned. Then he knelt down to Caleb's level, meeting those serious eyes directly without flinching. "Because I was with someone else. I chose to betray your mother when she needed me most. There's no excuse that makes it okay. There's no story that makes it better. It was the worst thing I've ever done." Caleb processed this with the careful consideration he gave to important information. "Do you wish you could change it?" "Every single day, every single moment. But wishing doesn't fix anything. Action does. I'm trying to be better now, but that doesn't erase what I did. It doesn't undo the hurt or make it okay." "Are you a bad person?" The question hit Sharon harder than expected. She almost intervened, almost told Caleb that was too harsh, too complicated for a child to ask. But David held up a hand slightly, asking for the space to answer honestly, to not be protected from consequences he'd earned. "I was. I made bad choices that hurt people. Your mother most of all." His voice was steady despite the pain visible on his face. "I'm trying not to be that person anymore. But you'll have to decide for yourself whether I've changed enough, whether I'm someone you want to know. That's your choice, not mine." Caleb looked at Sharon, then at Jonathan, who stood like a guardian angel, then back at David. "Johnny says people can learn to be better. Are you learning?" "I'm trying. That's all I can promise, that I'm trying every day." "Okay. Do you like dinosaurs?" Just like that, the heavy moment lifted like fog burning off David's expression, flickered between relief and confusion, and something that might have been gratitude. "I don't know much about them, do you? I know everything about dinosaurs. Come on, I'll teach you." Caleb grabbed David's hand without hesitation, without fear, and pulled him toward the playground. David looked back at Sharon, eyes wet with tears he was trying not to shed, silently asking if this was allowed, if he was really permitted to hold his son's hand after everything. Sharon nodded again. Jonathan's hand found hers, squeezed gently, grounding her in the present moment. They spent an hour watching Caleb talk David's ear off about dinosaurs, playground equipment, his favorite foods, why clouds don't fall down despite being made of water. David listened with complete attention, asked questions that showed genuine interest, laughed at Caleb's jokes about Triceratops having 3 horns for eating 3 times as much salad. He never tried to buy affection with false promises or elaborate gifts. Never undermined Sharon's parenting with permissive grandstanding, just showed up and paid attention like it was the most important thing he'd ever done. Because it was. Jonathan watched carefully, protective but not interfering, letting this moment unfold naturally. At one point, Caleb ran to the swings and David ended up on the bench beside Jonathan, two men connected by their care for the same child. "Thank you," David said quietly, staring at his hands. "For being good to them, both of them, for being what I should have been." "I'm not doing it for you." Jonathan's voice was firm but not unkind. "I know, that's why I'm thanking you, because you do it for them, not for recognition or credit." Jonathan studied him with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent decades evaluating people's character. "She still has nightmares sometimes. About the hospital, about leaving, about hemorrhaging alone while you were elsewhere. You need to know that you need to understand what you did." David closed his eyes, pain visible on his face. "I know. I'll carry that forever. If you hurt that boy even a fraction of what you hurt her, I'll make sure you regret it. We're clear. Crystal clear." Sharon watched this exchange from a distance, unable to hear the words but reading the body language. Two men who loved her son, one by biology, one by choice, negotiating the terms of Caleb's future. She should feel threatened by David's presence, by the possibility of him disrupting their family. Instead, she felt protected, guarded by Jonathan's steady presence and her own hard-won strength. When the hour ended, Caleb hugged David goodbye, quick, impulsive. The unself-conscious affection of a child who hadn't yet learned to guard his heart. David froze, then carefully hugged back, his face doing something complicated that suggested this was the first time in years he'd been touched with genuine affection. "Can we do this again?" Caleb asked, pulling back to look up at David's face. Sharon glanced at Jonathan. He gave a small nod of approval, trusting her judgment. "We'll see. If he keeps showing up the right way. If he keeps his promises." David stood alone as they walked to the car, watching them leave with an expression Sharon couldn't quite read. She looked back once through the car window. He was still standing there, hadn't moved, looking like a man who'd been granted something he'd never expected to receive, something he knew he didn't deserve but was grateful for anyway. In the rearview mirror, she saw him sit heavily on the bench, head dropping into his hands. She felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not forgiveness, she wasn't there yet, and might never be. Not trust, which would take years to rebuild if it happened at all, but maybe the faintest edge of letting go, of releasing some of the rage that had sustained her through the hardest times but had become exhausting to carry. "Mama, I like him," Caleb announced from the back seat, swinging his legs that didn't quite reach the floor. "Yeah? Yeah, he's really sad, but he's trying hard. That's important, right? Johnny says trying hard is what matters." Sharon met Jonathan's eyes across the car's interior. He smiled softly, that gentle expression that meant he understood without needing explanation. "Yes, baby, that's very important. Maybe the most important thing." They drove home through streets filled with people living their ordinary lives, unaware they'd just witnessed a small miracle, a woman learning to release the past without forgetting it. A child meeting his father for the first time with open curiosity instead of fear. A man getting an impossible second chance he'd spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. Sharon reached for Jonathan's hand on the center console. He took it without hesitation, without need for words. Together, they drove toward home, toward the future Sharon was building with her own hands, one where the past existed but didn't define them, one where forgiveness was possible but not required, one where love wasn't about perfection but about showing up consistently, day after day, choice after choice. David had finally learned to show up. Too late for their marriage, but maybe, just maybe, not too late for Caleb. Chapter 9. The Meeting. David Norrell had imagined meeting his son 1,000 times, but nothing prepared him for the reality of Caleb's eyes, Sharon's eyes, studying him with cautious curiosity that saw through every defense. The second meeting happened 3 weeks later. Same park, same rules. But this time Caleb was less cautious, more willing to engage. He'd brought a book about dinosaurs to show David, and he spent 20 minutes explaining the difference between pterodactyls and pteranodons with the serious authority of someone who'd memorized encyclopedias. David listened like Caleb was teaching him rocket science. Because in a way, he was. This was the accumulated knowledge of a boy David had missed raising. Every fact Caleb recited was proof of the life David had forfeited. "You're really interested in this stuff," Caleb observed, closing his book. "I'm interested in what you're interested in." Why? The question was so simple, so devastating. Why would a stranger care about his dinosaur obsession? Why would someone who'd been absent suddenly show interest now? David chose honesty. "Because I missed so much. I don't want to miss anything else." Caleb seemed to accept this. He reopened his book, pointed to a triceratops. "This one's my favorite, because it has 3 horns and it protected its family. That's important. Very important." "Do you protect your family?" David's throat closed. "I didn't, but I'm learning how. Johnny protects us. He makes sure Mama isn't sad anymore, and he plays with me even when he's tired." The words should have hurt, hearing his son praise another man for doing what David should have done. But instead, David felt grateful. Caleb was safe, loved, protected. That mattered more than David's ego. "Jonathan sounds like a good man." "He is. He's gonna marry Mama." David's heart stuttered. "Oh, yeah, he asked her already, but she said to ask again later. I think she'll say yes. I hope she does. Then I'll have a daddy." The logic was simple, brutal, true. Caleb didn't have a daddy. He had a biological father who was essentially a stranger, and Jonathan who was present. In a child's world, presence mattered more than genetics. "Would you like that? If Jonathan married your mum?" Caleb nodded enthusiastically. "Then we'd be a real family. Right now we're just pieces. Johnny says families are who you choose, not just who you're born with. Do you think that's true?" "I think Jonathan is very smart." They played for another half hour. When the time ended, Caleb hugged David goodbye again, longer this time, more comfortable. David held on carefully, terrified of squeezing too tight or letting go too soon. After Caleb ran back to Sharon and Jonathan, David remained on the bench. Sharon approached alone. Jonathan stayed with Caleb, giving them space. "He's incredible," David said. "You've done an amazing job." "I know." No false modesty, no deflection, just acknowledgement of the work she'd done alone, while David was busy destroying everything. "Sharon, Don't." She held up a hand. "Whatever you're about to say, I don't need to hear it. This isn't about us. It never will be again. This is about Caleb having access to his biological father if he wants it." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because I need to be very clear. You're here on probation, permanent probation. One slip, one broken promise, one moment of putting yourself first and you're done. Caleb won't remember you were ever here." The threat was real. David heard it clearly. "I won't mess this up." "You already messed it up. You're just getting a chance not to mess it up worse." Sharon walked away before David could respond. Jonathan caught his eye across the playground, gave him a slight nod. Recognition, not friendship, just acknowledgement that they were both showing up for the same kid. David drove home to his empty apartment and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back. Gratitude, grief, hope, terror. All of it crashed over him in waves while he sat in his parked car outside the building he'd lived in for 2 years. Ruth called. "How'd it go?" "Good. Really good." "He's perfect, Ruth." "Of course he is. Kid's got Sharon's genetics. Now don't screw it up." "Everyone keeps telling me that." "Because you have a history of screwing things up. Prove us wrong." She hung up. David smiled, despite everything. Ruth's particular brand of tough love had kept him anchored when he'd wanted to drown. The third meeting happened 2 weeks later. Then a fourth. Then they started happening weekly. Caleb slowly opened up, talking about school, friends, his favorite shows. He stopped treating David like a stranger and started treating him like someone interesting who was around sometimes. It wasn't father-son bonding. It was more like Caleb was collecting an additional adult in his life, someone who showed up when he said he would, who listened when Caleb talked, who didn't make promises he couldn't keep. During the fifth meeting, Caleb asked, "Can you come to my school thing next month? We're doing a play about dinosaurs and I'm the narrator." David's chest constricted. "I don't know if your mum would." "I already asked her. She said if you wanted to, and if Johnny was there too." "Then yes, absolutely yes." Caleb grinned. "Cool. You'll see my costume. Mama made it. She's really good at making stuff." "She is." The play was in a crowded elementary school auditorium. David sat in the back row, Jonathan and Sharon 3 rows ahead. Caleb was brilliant. Confident, clear-voiced, adorable in his dinosaur narrator costume. David's eyes burned, watching his son command the stage with natural charisma. Afterward, in the hallway chaos of proud parents and overstimulated kids, Caleb ran to all 3 of them, hugged Sharon first, then Jonathan, then David. "Did you see me? I didn't mess up any lines." "You were perfect," David said, voice thick. "I'm so proud of you." The words came out before he could consider if he had the right to say them. Caleb beamed anyway. Sharon was watching. When David met her eyes, he saw something unexpected. Not forgiveness, not trust, but maybe, possibly, the smallest acknowledgement that he was trying. She nodded once, then turned away to talk to another parent. It was enough. David walked to his car alone, sat in the darkness of the parking lot, and let himself feel everything pride in a son he barely knew. Gratitude for a chance he didn't deserve. Hope that maybe somehow he could be part of Caleb's life in a small way, not as a father. Jonathan had earned that title, but as someone who cared, someone who showed up, someone Caleb could count on. It was more than David had imagined possible, and he'd spent every remaining day of his life trying to deserve it. He drove home through streets wet with recent rain, past houses where families were sitting down to dinner together, where children were being tucked into bed by fathers who'd never abandoned them. David didn't belong in that world anymore. But maybe, just maybe, he could exist on its edges, present enough to matter to Caleb, distant enough not to threaten the family Sharon had built. That was all he could ask for, all he deserved, and somehow, miraculously, more than enough. Chapter 10. The Empire she built. Sharon Blunt married Jonathan Reeves on a Saturday in May, surrounded by everyone who mattered, and the absence of what might have been didn't haunt her anymore. The ceremony was small, garden setting, close friends and family only. Caleb was ring-bearer, taking his job so seriously that everyone smiled. Sharon wore cream instead of white, something elegant and simple that felt like her. Jonathan cried when she walked down the aisle, actually cried, not ashamed of it. David wasn't invited. Sharon had been clear about that, and David had respected it without protest. He'd sent a card. "I hope you have the life you always deserved. Thank you for letting me know, Caleb. That's more grace than I earned." Sharon read it once, filed it away with other paperwork, and didn't think about it again until months later. The wedding itself was perfect. Vows that Sharon actually meant. Promises she believed Jonathan would keep. When he kissed her, she felt safe instead of swept away, steady instead of passionate. It was exactly what she needed. Caleb declared it the best wedding ever, primarily because of the cake. He spent the reception telling anyone who'd listen about how his mom and Jonathan were married now, and that meant they were officially a family. "What about your other dad?" someone asked innocently. Caleb shrugged. "David's David. He comes to my school stuff, but Johnny's my dad." Simple as that. In a child's logic, presence-determined relationship. David was someone who showed up monthly. Jonathan was someone who lived with them, helped with homework, read bedtime stories, and had earned the title through consistency. 5 years passed faster than Sharon expected. Her firm tripled in size. She hired more attorneys, expanded services, built a reputation that had other firms trying to poach her constantly. She stayed independent. This was her empire, built from devastation, proof that starting over was possible. Jonathan remained her partner in every sense. They argued about work-life balance. He still forgot important dates occasionally. She still worked too many hours, but they talked through it, apologized, adjusted, showed up. That was the difference between marriage and what she'd had with David. Effort was mutual. David remained on the periphery, exactly where he belonged. Once a month, visits, school events when invited. He never pushed for more, never complained about Jonathan's central role in Caleb's life, just showed up when permitted and left when appropriate. Caleb grew into a thoughtful kid who loved science and asked impossible questions. He called Jonathan Dad and David David and seemed unbothered by the complexity. One afternoon, Sharon stood in her office overlooking the city. Her desk held a photo from her wedding day. Caleb between her and Jonathan, all three of them laughing. On the wall, almost hidden, a small news clipping about David's non-profit receiving national recognition. She kept it not out of sentiment, but acknowledgement. People could change. David had changed. That didn't erase history, but it mattered anyway. Jonathan entered, wrapped arms around her waist. Caleb wants to know if David can come to his science fair next month. Sharon leaned into his steady warmth. Both of you there? Of course. Then yes. Jonathan kissed her temple. You've built something remarkable. Sharon turned in his arms. We built it, that's the difference. That evening, the three of them sat on their terrace after dinner. Caleb was absorbed in homework. Jonathan was reading, Sharon was working on a brief. It was ordinary, quiet, perfect. Later, alone in their room, Jonathan asked what she'd been avoiding, thinking about. Do you ever regret it, any of it? Sharon thought about it honestly. The pain, the devastation, the long nights crying while Caleb slept, the years of rebuilding. No, because I wouldn't be who I am without it. I wouldn't have built what I built. I wouldn't have you. The past was brutal, but it taught me I could survive anything. You're extraordinary. I'm just someone who refused to stay broken. They lay in comfortable silence until Sharon fell asleep, Jonathan's steady breathing beside her, Caleb safe down the hall, her life solid and real and hers. Sharon Blunt had learned the greatest revenge wasn't destruction, it was building a life so extraordinary that the past became nothing more than a scar she forgot to notice anymore. David existed in her world now as a footnote, present enough for Caleb, distant enough to be irrelevant to her happiness, and that was perfect. The story of Sharon's life wasn't about the man who'd betrayed her. It was about the woman who'd risen from devastation and built an empire from the ashes she'd won, not by destroying David, but by making his choices irrelevant to her joy. And that was the truest victory of all.